Henry III, also known as Henry of Winchester, was King of England, Lord of Ireland and Duke of Aquitaine from 1216 until his death. The son of King John and Isabella of Angoulême, Henry assumed the throne when he was only 9 in the middle of the First Barons' War. Cardinal Guala declared the war against the rebel barons to be a religious crusade, and Henry's forces, led by William Marshal, defeated the rebels at the battles of Lincoln and Sandwich in 1217. Henry promised to abide by the Great Charter of 1225, which limited royal power and protected the rights of the major barons. His early rule was dominated first by Hubert de Burgh and then Peter des Roches, who re-established royal authority after the war. In 1230 the king attempted to reconquer the provinces of France that had once belonged to his father, but the invasion was a debacle. A revolt led by William Marshal's son, Richard, broke out in 1232, ending in a peace settlement negotiated by the Church. Following the revolt, Henry ruled England personally, rather than governing through senior ministers. He travelled less than previous monarchs, investing heavily in a handful of his favourite palaces and castles. He married Eleanor of Provence, with whom he had 5 children. Henry was known for his piety, holding lavish religious ceremonies and giving generously to charities. The king was particularly devoted to the figure of Edward the Confessor, whom he adopted as his patron saint. He extracted huge sums of money from the Jews in England, ultimately crippling their ability to do business. And as attitudes towards the Jews hardened, he introduced the Statute of Jewry, attempting to segregate the community. In a fresh attempt to reclaim his family's lands in France, he invaded Poitou in 1242, leading to the disastrous Battle of Taillebourg. After this, Henry relied on diplomacy, cultivating an alliance with Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. Henry supported his brother Richard in his bid to become King of the Romans in 1256. But was unable to place his own son Edmund on the throne of Sicily. Despite investing large amounts of money, he planned to go on crusade to the Levant, but was prevented from doing so by rebellions in Gascony. By 1258, Henry's rule was increasingly unpopular, the result of the failure of his expensive foreign policies and the notoriety of his Poitevin half-brothers, the Lucinians, as well as the role of his local officials in collecting taxes and debts. A coalition of his barons, initially probably backed by Eleanor, seized power in a coup d'état and expelled the Poitevins from England, reforming the royal government through a process called the Provisions of Oxford. Henry and the baronial government enacted a peace with France in 1259, under which Henry gave up his rights to his other lands in France in return for King Louis IX of France recognizing him as the rightful ruler of Gascony. The baronial regime collapsed, but Henry was unable to reform a stable government, and instability across England continued. In 1263 one of the more radical barons, Simon de Montfort, seized power, resulting in the Second Barons' War. Henry persuaded Louis to support his cause and mobilized an army. The Battle of Lewes occurred in 1264, where Henry was defeated and taken prisoner. Henry's eldest son, Edward, escaped from captivity to defeat de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham the following year and freed his father. Henry initially enacted a harsh revenge on the remaining rebels, but was persuaded by the Church to mollify his policies through the dictum of Kenilworth. Reconstruction was slow and Henry had to acquiesce to various measures, including further suppression of the Jews, to maintain baronial and popular support. Henry died in 1272, leaving Edward as his successor. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, which he had rebuilt in the second half of his reign, and was moved to his current tomb in 1290. Some miracles were declared after his death, but he was not canonized. Background and childhood. Henry was born in Winchester Castle on 1 October 1207. He was the eldest son of King John and Isabella of Angoulême. Little is known of Henry's early life. He was initially looked after by a wet nurse called Ellen in the south of England, away from John's itinerant court, and probably had close ties to his mother. Henry had 4 legitimate younger brothers and sisters: Richard, Joan, Isabella and Eleanor, and various older illegitimate siblings. In 1212 his education was entrusted to Peter des Roches, the Bishop of Winchester, under his direction. Henry was given military training by Philip d'Orbigny and taught to ride, probably by Ralph of St. Sampson. Little is known about Henry's appearance. He was probably around 168 centimeters tall, and accounts recorded after his death suggested that he had a strong build, with a drooping eyelid. Henry grew up to occasionally show flashes of a fierce temper, but mostly, as historian David Carpenter describes, he had an amiable, easy-going, and sympathetic personality. He was unaffected and honest, and showed his emotions readily, easily being moved to tears by religious sermons. At the start of the 13th century, the Kingdom of England formed part of an empire spreading across Western Europe. Henry was named after his grandfather, Henry II, who had built up this vast network of lands stretching from Scotland and Wales, through England, across the English Channel to the territories of Normandy, Brittany, Maine and Anjou in northwest France, on to Poitou and Gascony in the southwest. For many years the French crown was relatively weak, enabling first Henry II, and then his sons Richard and John, to dominate France. In 1204, John lost Normandy, Brittany, Maine and Anjou to Philip II of France, leaving English power on the continent limited to Gascony and Poitou. John raised taxes to pay for military campaigns to regain his lands. But unrest grew among many of the English barons. John sought new allies by declaring England a papal fiefdom, owing allegiance to the Pope. In 1215, John and the rebel barons negotiated a potential peace treaty, the Magna Carta. The treaty would have limited potential abuses of royal power, demobilized the rebel armies and set up a power-sharing arrangement. But in practice neither side complied with its conditions. John and the Loyalist barons firmly repudiated the Magna Carta and the First Barons' War erupted, with the rebel barons aided by Philip's son, the future Louis VIII, who claimed the English throne for himself. The war soon settled into a stalemate, with neither side able to claim victory. The king became ill and died on the night of the 18th of October, leaving the 9-year-old Henry as his heir. Minority. Coronation. Henry was staying safely at Corfe Castle in Dorset with his mother when King John died. On his deathbed, John appointed a council of 13 executors to help Henry reclaim the kingdom, and requested that his son be placed into the guardianship of William Marshal, one of the most famous knights in England. The Loyalist leaders decided to crown Henry immediately to reinforce his claim to the throne. William knighted the boy, and Cardinal Guala Bicchieri, the papal legate to England, then oversaw his coronation at Gloucester Cathedral on the 28th of October. In the absence of the Archbishops of Canterbury or York, he was anointed by the Bishops of Worcester and Exeter, and crowned by Peter des Roches. The royal crown had been either lost or sold during the Civil War, so instead the ceremony used a simple gold corolla belonging to Queen Isabella. The young king inherited a difficult situation, with over half of England occupied by the rebels and most of his father's continental possessions still in French hands. He had substantial support, however, from Guala, who intended to win the civil war for Henry and punish the rebels. Guala set about strengthening the ties between England and the papacy, starting with the coronation itself, where Henry gave homage to the papacy, recognizing the Pope as his feudal lord. Pope Honorius declared that Henry was the Pope's vassal and ward, and that the legate had complete authority to protect Henry and his kingdom. As an additional measure, Henry took the cross, declaring himself a crusader and so entitled to special protection from Rome. 2 senior nobles stood out as candidates to head Henry's regency government. The first was William, who, although elderly, was renowned for his personal loyalty and could help support the war with his own men and material. The second was Ranulph de Blondeville, the Earl of Chester and one of the most powerful loyalist barons. William diplomatically waited until both Guala and Ranulph had requested him to take up the post before assuming power. William then appointed Des Roches to be Henry's guardian, freeing himself up to lead the military effort. End of the Barons' War. The war was not going well for the Loyalists, and the new Regency government considered retreating to Ireland. Prince Louis and the rebel barons, however, were also finding it difficult to make further progress. Despite Louis controlling Westminster Abbey, he could not be crowned king because the English Church and the papacy backed Henry. John's death had diffused some of the rebel concerns, and the royal castles were still holding out in the occupied parts of the country. In a bid to take advantage of this, Henry encouraged the rebel barons to come back to his cause in exchange for the return of their lands, and reissued a version of the Magna Carta, albeit having first removed some of the clauses, including those unfavourable to the papacy. The move was not successful and opposition to Henry's new government hardened. In February, Louis set sail for France to gather reinforcements. In his absence, arguments broke out between Louis's French and English followers, and Cardinal Guala declared that Henry's war against the rebels was a religious crusade. This resulted in a series of defections from the rebel movement, and the tide of the conflict swung in Henry's favour. Louis returned at the end of April and reinvigorated his campaign, splitting his forces into two groups, sending one north to besiege Lincoln Castle and keeping one in the south to capture Dover Castle. When he learnt that Louis had divided his army, William Marshall gambled on defeating the rebels in a single battle. William marched north and attacked Lincoln on the 20th of May, entering through a side gate. He took the city in a sequence of fierce street battles and sacked the buildings. In the aftermath of Lincoln, the Loyalist campaign stalled and only recommenced in late June when the victors had arranged the ransoming of their prisoners. Meanwhile, support for Louis's campaign was diminishing in France, and he concluded that the war in England was lost. The French prince negotiated terms with Cardinal Guala, under which he would renounce his claim to the English throne. In return, his followers would be given back their lands. Any sentences of excommunication would be lifted and Henry's government would promise to enforce the Magna Carta. The proposed agreement soon began to unravel amid claims from some loyalists that it was too generous towards the rebels, particularly the clergy who had joined the rebellion. In the absence of a settlement, Louis remained in London with his remaining forces. On the 24th of August 1217, a French fleet arrived off the coast of Sandwich, bringing Louis's soldiers, siege engines and fresh supplies. Hubert de Burgh, Henry's justiciar, set sail to intercept it, resulting in the Battle of Sandwich. De Burgh's fleet scattered the French and captured their flagship, commanded by Eustace the monk, who was promptly executed. When the news reached Louis, he entered into fresh peace negotiations. Henry, Isabella, Louis, Guala and William came to agreement on the final Treaty of Lambeth, also known as the Treaty of Kingston, on the 12th and the 13th of September. The treaty was similar to the first peace offer, but excluded the rebel clergy, whose lands and appointments remained forfeit. Louis accepted a gift of £6,666 to speed his departure from England, and promised to try to persuade King Philip to return Henry's lands in France. Louis left England as agreed and joined the Albigensian Crusade in the south of France, restoring royal authority with the end of the Civil War. Henry's government faced the task of rebuilding royal authority across large parts of the country. By the end of 1217, many former rebels were routinely ignoring instructions from the centre, and even Henry's loyalist supporters jealously maintained their independent control over royal castles. Illegally constructed fortifications, called adulterine castles, had sprung up across much of the country. The network of county sheriffs had collapsed, and with it the ability to raise taxes and collect royal revenues. The powerful Welsh Prince Llywelyn posed a major threat in Wales and along the Welsh marches. Despite his success in winning the war, William had far less success in restoring royal power following the peace. In part, this was because William was unable to offer significant patronage, despite the expectations from the Loyalist barons that they would be rewarded. William attempted to enforce the traditional rights of the crown to approve marriages and wardships, but with little success. Nonetheless, William was able to reconstitute the royal bench of judges and reopen the royal exchequer. The government issued the Charter of the Forest, which attempted to reform the royal governance of the forests. The Regency and Llywelyn came to agreement on the Treaty of Worcester in 1218. At its generous terms, Llywelyn became effectively Henry's justiciar across Wales, underlined the weakness of the English crown. Henry's mother was unable to establish a role for herself in the Regency government and she returned to France in 1217, marrying Hugh de Lusignan, a powerful Poitevin noble. William Marshal fell ill and died in April 1219. The replacement government was formed around a grouping of three senior ministers: Pandulf, the replacement papal legate, Peter des Roches, and Hubert de Burgh, a former justiciar. The three were appointed by a great council of the nobility at Oxford, and the government came to depend on these councils for authority. Hubert and des Roches were political rivals, with Hubert supported by a network of English barons, and des Roches backed by nobles from the royal territories in Poitou and Touraine. Hubert moved decisively against des Roches in 1221, accusing him of treason and removing him as the king's guardian. The bishop left England for the Crusades. Pandulf was recalled by Rome the same year, leaving Hubert as the dominant force in Henry's government. Initially the new government had little success, but in 1220 the fortunes of Henry's government began to improve. The Pope allowed Henry to be crowned for a second time, using a new set of royal regalia. The fresh coronation was intended to affirm the authority of the king. Henry promised to restore the powers of the crown, and the barons swore that they would give back the royal castles and pay their debts to the crown, on the threat of excommunication. Hubert, accompanied by Henry, moved into Wales to suppress Llywelyn in 1223, and in England his forces steadily reclaimed Henry's castles. The effort against the remaining recalcitrant barons came to a head in 1224 with the siege of Bedford Castle, which Henry and Hubert besieged for 8 weeks. When it finally fell, almost all of the garrison were executed. Meanwhile, Louis VIII of France allied himself with Hugh de Lusignan and invaded first Poitou and then Gascony. Henry's army in Poitou was under-resourced and lacked support from the Poitevin barons, many of whom had felt abandoned during the years of Henry's minority. As a result, the province quickly fell. It became clear that Gascony would also fall unless reinforcements were sent from England. In early 1225 a great council approved a tax of £40,000 to dispatch an army, which quickly retook Gascony. In exchange for agreeing to support Henry, the barons demanded that the king reissue the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest. This time the king declared that the charters were issued of his own, spontaneous and free will, and confirmed them with the royal seal, giving the new Great Charter and the Charter of the Forest of 1225 much more authority than any previous versions. The barons anticipated that the king would act in accordance with these definitive charters, subject to the law and moderated by the advice of the nobility.